The crunch of gravel, sharp in the cold pre-dawn air, was the only warning. 3 men, silhouetted against the meager moonlight of April 14, 1944, froze. They were French. They were Maquis. And they were deep inside occupied France, miles from the safety of the Vercors Massif. Their target was a critical railway culvert on the main line north of Grenoble, an artery carrying panzer, refits, and ammunition to Normandy. The leader, codename Antoine, cursed silently. His team had been placing the 30-pound RDX charge, a clumsy, heavy brick of British-supplied explosive. The work was slow, the wiring delicate in the damp. Then, the shout. "Halt!" A German patrol, materializing from the shadows of the embankment. The night shattered. The sharp, ripping sound of a German MP-40 submachine gun was answered by the slower, heavier thump of a British Sten gun. Antoine's men were brave, but they were outgunned, and worse, exposed. They had failed the first rule of sabotage: speed. The firefight was brutal and mercifully short. The surviving partisans vanished back into the scrubland, leaving behind their prize, the undetonated charge, and 2 of their own. 500 yards up the ridge, lying prone in the darkness, a 4th man watched the entire tragedy unfold through field glasses. He wore no uniform, just rough civilian trousers and a dark jacket. He was not French. He was an American, an engineer inserted by the OSS weeks earlier, codenamed Leo. He felt the familiar cold knot of frustration. This was the 3rd attempt on this line. This was the 3rd failure. The British method of more bang was loud, slow, and getting good men killed. It was tactical, but it wasn't strategic. The old belief held that to stop a train, one had to destroy the track, the bridge, or the locomotive itself with a massive concussive force. Leo knew that belief was wrong. He wasn't there to watch. He was there to test an idea that violated every principle of conventional demolitions. He was there to prove that to stop a 2.0-ton steel behemoth, you didn't need 30 pounds of RDX. You just needed one simple 4-pound piece of forged steel. He was there to introduce the M3 rail device, and it was about to change the Shadow War. This was not a story of massive armies clashing, but of quiet, precise, and lethal innovation, hidden deep in enemy territory. If you're fascinated by these forgotten stories of ingenuity under pressure, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The man codenamed Leo was, in reality, Dr. Elias Thorne, a metallurgist on loan from the U.S. War Department, seconded to the newly formed Office of Strategic Services. He was not a soldier. He winced at the sound of gunfire and loathed the cold, damp forests of the Isère region. His war was meant to be fought on graph paper, in laboratories, and in the controlled environment of the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Yet here he was, attached to an operational group, call sign Tinopenaire, deep in France, watching the very problem he was sent to solve play out in blood. His frustration was not with the partisans, it was with the physics of the problem. That night, huddled in the shepherd's hut that served as the local command post, he listened to the debrief. Antoine was furious, grieving, and resigned. "It is impossible," Antoine said, his voice raw. "The Boche patrols are too frequent. The charges are too heavy. It takes 20 minutes to set a proper charge. They give us 5. We cannot break the line." Thorne remained silent, sketching in his notebook by the light of a flickering grease lamp. The other OSS operators, hardened soldiers, fluent in French, trained to kill, looked at Thorne with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He was the gadget man, the civilian sent by Wild Bill Donovan's R&D branch, a man who seemed more concerned with why a thing worked than if it worked. Captain Marcus, the OG commander, had been blunt on their arrival. "Doctor, I don't care about your theories. I care about results. We need that line cut, and we need it cut by Friday." Thorne looked at his sketches. The others saw a railroad track as a target. Thorne saw it as a system balanced on a terrifyingly simple principle: a 1-inch wide flange of steel on the inside of a wheel, holding 80 tons of locomotive upright against the rail. The current doctrine, based on WWI trench warfare, was to apply explosive force downward or laterally to shatter the rail. This required massive amounts of explosive, created a huge flash and report, and left a crater that German pioneer battalions could repair in hours. His mind was elsewhere. He recalled a report from a British SOE agent in 1943. The agent had detailed a successful, if accidental, derailment. A farmer's cart had broken on a level crossing, leaving a single metal axle bracket on the track. A German supply train moving slowly had hit it. The result was not an explosion, but a lifting. The locomotive had climbed, tipped, and fallen, blocking the line for 3 days. The report had been dismissed as an anomaly. Thorne saw it as a revelation. He looked up from his notebook at the despondent faces of the French resistance fighters. "You are trying to break the rail," Thorne said quietly, his voice academic. "You should be using the rail." The men stared at him, confused. Captain Marcus just sighed, rubbing his face. "Thorne, now is not the time for engineering." "Captain," Thorne persisted, tapping his drawing, "the Germans have 10,000 troops and 500 tons of supplies moving down this line every 24 hours. We've been trying to blow it up. What if we just unzipped it?" The mystery of his words hung in the air. He was talking about a new form of sabotage, one that required no explosives, no wires, and almost no time. What he didn't know was that this quiet idea, born of frustration in a cold French hut, would soon be responsible for paralyzing a dozen German divisions. To understand the genius of Thorne's idea, one had to first understand the sheer, overwhelming scale of the problem facing the Allies in the spring of 1944. The problem was not the Atlantic Wall, it was what lay behind it. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, had designated the entire Société Nationale des Chemins de Fer Français, SNCF, the French National Railway, as a strategic military asset. It was the circulatory system of the German war machine in the West. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every loaf of bread, and most critically, every panzer division, moved by rail. The Allied High Command, specifically Schaff, knew that the success of the impending D-Day invasion depended entirely on one factor: isolation. The Wehrmacht held powerful, elite armored reserves, including the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 11th Panzer Division, deep in southern and central France. If these divisions could reach the Normandy beaches within 48 hours, they would drive the Allies back into the sea. The official Schaff projection was stark. Failure to interdict German reinforcement routes will result in the failure of the invasion. The mission to sever these routes was given a code name: Plan Vert, Green Plan. It was a joint operation between the Allied Air Forces and the SOE-OSS-led resistance. The Air Forces, primarily the U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces, were tasked with transportation targets. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs on major rail yards, in places like Trappes, Amiens, and Rouen. The damage was immense, but it was not precise. Bombs from 20,000 feet could not reliably hit a specific bridge or track section. Furthermore, the civilian cost was horrific, turning French public opinion, and the repair crews, German, pionnier, and conscripted French workers, were brutally efficient. A bombed-out rail yard could be bypassed or repaired within 72 hours. This left the second, more surgical arm of Plan Vert, the resistance. SOE and OSS teams parachuted into France with a single massive directive: cut the rails. They were supplied with millions of pounds of explosives. But the field reports flowing back to London in early 1944 were deeply troubling. A field report from Agent Vulture, SOE, dated March 2, 1944, read, Target main line, Lyon-Perpignan. Team of 8. Track patrolled by Sicherungsdienst squads every 40 minutes. Heavy tree cover, but noise travels. Attempted placement of 20 kilo charge. Spotted by patrol. Team forced to withdraw. Mission failed. The Germans were not idle. They had deployed entire Sicherungsdivisionen, security divisions, tens of thousands of older or lower category troops, whose sole job was to guard bridges, tunnels, and track sections. They ran armored patrol trains, employed dogs, and cleared vegetation from the railbeds to create open killing fields. Standard demolition doctrine was failing. It was too loud, too slow, and required too much specialized training. A partisan, often a farmer or a teenager, could not be expected to calculate the precise placement and tamping of an explosive charge under fire. The British solution was the time pencil detonator, but the core problem remained. The act of sabotage was a 20-minute high-risk operation. The Allies needed a 20-second one. The psychological weight of this impossibility was crushing. The Joes, the radio operators for the OSS and SOE teams, sent increasingly desperate signals. They were running out of men. The resistance was brave, but they were being systematically hunted and executed. Every failed attempt, every man lost trying to plant a charge, was a victory for the Reichsbahn. The numbers were grim. By April 1944, Plan Vert was achieving less than 15% of its interdiction goals. The German armored divisions sat in their barracks, their trains fueled and ready, waiting for the invasion they knew was coming. Experts in London's War Office, reviewing the data, reluctantly agreed. A truly effective widespread paralysis of the French rail system by partisans alone couldn't be done. The human cost of this equation was paid in the frozen ditches and dark forests of France. It was paid by men like Antoine's team and by thousands like them. The statistics that landed on desks in London, 15% interdiction, were written in the blood of local resistance cells. A failed mission was not just a data point, it was a reprisal. It was the Sicherungsdienst, surrounding a village, executing the mayor, and burning the farmhouses of suspected maquisards. The physical toll was just as severe. The partisans were not professional soldiers. They were bakers, students, and mechanics, living on the maquis, in the scrubland. They were perpetually cold, perpetually hungry, and perpetually hunted. An OSS field report from Operation Tinopanair detailed the condition of their local contacts. Morale is brittle. Team Antoine has been operating for 3 months. They have received 1 supply drop. They are armed with a mix of captured German weapons, British Sten guns, and 2 1918-era hunting rifles. Half the men have no boots, their feet wrapped in cloth. Dysentery is rampant. This was the reality of the glorious resistance. It was a war of exhaustion, fought by men who knew their life expectancy was measured in weeks. When they were ordered to sabotage a rail line, they did so knowing the immense risk. It wasn't just the German patrols, it was the act itself. Hauling a 50-pound crate of RDX, plus wires, batteries, and detonators, 5 miles through hostile territory was a marathon of terror. The equipment was heavy, clumsy, and optimized for British commandos, not starving civilians. The failure of the mission near Grenoble was a symptom of this deeper hopelessness. Antoine's men hadn't just lost 2 comrades, they had lost the belief that their actions mattered. They would risk death, but they would not risk it for nothing. "We blow the track," Antoine had spat at Captain Marcus, and the next day we hear the trains. The Boche repair it. We die, and the trains run. Hadron. This was the core of the human problem. The effort-to-reward ratio was fatally skewed. The risk was 100%, the impact was 10%. The experts in London and Washington, comfortable in their heated offices, had decreed it impossible based on logistics. The men on the ground, freezing in a shepherd's hut, knew it was impossible based on fear, exhaustion, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of a man with a rifle versus a man with 50 pounds of explosives. The war planners needed 1,000 cuts to bleed the German army. But they had forgotten that each cut had to be made by a human hand, a hand that was trembling, cold, and losing faith. Elias Thorne was not a man built for this world. Born in 1905 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, he was the son of a railroad man. His entire life had been steeped in the smell of coal smoke, lubricating oil, and hot steel. He wasn't a soldier, a spy, or an adventurer. He was a thinker, a man of quiet observation. He had graduated top of his class from Carnegie Tech with a degree in metallurgical engineering. By 1940, he was a mid-level manager at the Pennsylvania Railroad's massive Altoona works, specializing in track mechanics and load-bearing stress. His job was to analyze derailments, to understand why steel failed. He was 37 years old, wore spectacles, and suffered from mild asthma. When the war broke out, he was classified 4F, unfit for military service. He was, by his own admission, a railroad man, stuck in a railroad town. But his mind was sharp, and his specific expertise was rare. In 1B, his obscure 1939 paper, Analysis of Flange Climb Derailment Under Lateral Stress, was forwarded by a former professor to a contact in the newly formed Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI, the precursor to the OSS. In mid-1942, Thorne was summoned to Washington, D.C. He met a charismatic, eccentric man named Stanley Lovell, a chemist who had been tapped by General Wild Bill Donovan to head the new OSS Research and Development Branch. Lovell's mandate was simple. You are to create the tools of unconventional warfare. I want you to be my Professor Moriarty. Lovell was hiring academics, prankster chemists, and engineers, not to build bombs, but to build trouble. He hired Thorne not despite his 4F status, but because of it. He didn't want a soldier. He wanted a man who understood the enemy's systems. Thorne was assigned to Area B, the OSS's secret R&D facility near Washington. For a year he worked on mundane projects, analyzing captured German rail components, calculating the explosive requirements to sever different types of track. But he grew increasingly frustrated. The military brass in the Special Operations SO branch, which handled sabotage, were obsessed with brute force. They were, in his private opinion, an army of carpenters who believed every problem was a nail. They kept asking him how to make a bigger explosion, how to cut a rail faster with explosives. Thorne kept trying to explain that they were asking the wrong question. He wasn't interested in breaking the rail. He was interested in disappointing, the fundamental mechanical contract between the wheel and the track. He was a quiet, stubborn, and deeply pragmatic man. He saw the piles of RDX and C3 plastic explosive being shipped to England and felt it was a colossal waste. It was, he wrote in a memo, logistically cumbersome, tactically noisy, and strategically naive. The memo was promptly buried by a colonel in the SO branch. But Thorne was not a man who gave up on a physics problem. He was simply a man waiting for the right data. The data arrived in late 1943, in the form of the anomalous SOE report about the farmer's cart. Thorne seized it. He took it directly to a sympathetic section head in R&D, bypassing the military chain of command. This, he said, holding the report, is the key. It's not a bomb, it's leverage. He went back to his workshop, and using the principles from his 1939 paper, began to sketch. He wasn't designing a weapon. He was designing a key to unlock a catastrophic kinetic failure. His insight was simple. A train's flange keeps it on the track. If you can, for a fraction of a second, lift that flange over the railhead, The 80-ton locomotive and all the kinetic energy behind it will do the rest of the work. It won't explode. It will simply fall over. He sketched a small, dense, wedge-shaped piece of metal designed to be clipped to the inside of the rail. It had a groove to accept the wheel flange and a precisely calculated ramp. As the wheel hit it, the device would guide the flange up and over the rail. He presented his sketch to the SO Branch Procurement Board in January 1944. The board was comprised of 2 Army colonels and a Navy captain. Thorne, in his ill-fitting civilian suit, explained the physics. When he finished, one of the colonels leaned forward. "Doctor, are you telling me that you want us to stop sending 50-pound demolition kits to France and instead send these doorstops?" The room filled with laughter. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," the other colonel said. "We're fighting the Wehrmacht, son, not trying to win a science fair." Thorne's proposal was officially rejected. Device rail, wedge, Thorne, was deemed impractical for field use. But his R&D superior, the one who had seen the SOE report, pulled him aside. "Elias," he said, "the Army is full of idiots. They want a bang. But Donovan wants results. We just received a priority order from Chef. They're desperate. Planvert is failing." He quietly signed a work order for 100 pounds of high-grade tool steel and access to the machine shop at Area B. "Build your doorstop, Doctor," he said. "Build it and make it work. But you're on your own." Thorne didn't hesitate. He knew he couldn't prove his theory on paper. He had to prove it on a track. He gathered a single ally, a skeptical but brilliant master machinist named Sarge Peterson, who ran the Area B workshop. "It'll never work, Doc," Sarge said, looking at the blueprints. "Them wheels will just crush it flat, or spit it out." "No, they won't," Thorne insisted, pointing to his calculations. "If the Brinell hardness is correct, and the angle of the ramp is less than 12 degrees, the wheel has to climb. It has no choice. The lateral force is too great." For 2 weeks they worked in secret, mostly at night, in a cordoned-off section of the workshop. The official log stated they were testing ballistic shields for field radios. Instead, they were forging and milling. They used a high manganese steel, prized for its extreme toughness and resistance to abrasion. The first prototypes were clumsy, heavy castings. The challenge was the fastener. How could a partisan, in the dark, in the cold, with numb fingers, attach this thing to a rail in seconds? Thorne tried clamps, bolts, and wires. All were too slow. Finally, Sarge had the breakthrough. He fabricated a simple, powerful spring steel clip, similar to a carpenter's clamp, that was integrated into the wedge's body. A man could carry it in a coat pocket. To apply it, he simply had to walk up to the rail and snap it into place. 1 motion, 1 second. They timed it. The device, now designated the M3, could be attached in under 3 seconds. Detaching it was just as fast. They needed a test. In a secluded rail spur behind Area B, used for delivering coal, they waited until 3:00 a.m. They had a single, decommissioned hopper car loaded with scrap iron weighing 40 tons. They pushed it by hand to the top of a small gradient, 100 yards from the test site. Thorne, his hands shaking, walked down the track and snapped the 4-pound M3 onto the rail. He stepped back. "Okay, Sarge," he yelled. Sarge released the brake. The hopper car began to roll slowly, then faster. Click, clack. Click, clack. Click, clack. It hit the M3. There was no explosion, just a single high-pitched screech of metal on metal. A sound of profound mechanical protest. The front wheel of the car, just as Thorne had calculated, lifted, cleared the rail, and dropped into the gravel ballast. The 40-ton car didn't stop. It lurched violently to the left, dug its front axle into the earth, and toppled onto its side with a catastrophic groan and the sound of shattering timber. The silence that followed was deafening. Thorne and Sarge stared. The hopper car was completely, hopelessly off the tracks. "Well, I'll be," Sarge whispered. "The son of a bitch worked." The victory was short-lived. Thorne presented his findings and the film of the test to the same board. They were impressed, but terrified. "You've created a device that is too simple," one colonel argued. "What if the enemy reverse engineers it? What if our own partisans use it on the wrong trains? It's uncontrollable." They agreed to a limited production run of 100 units. But they added a catch, one they were sure Thorne would refuse. The device had to be validated in a combat zone by a technical observer. "You want this thing in the war, Doctor?" the colonel challenged him. "You're going to have to take it there yourself." 2 weeks later, Elias Thorne, a 4F railroad engineer, was on a blacked-out B-24 Liberator, part of a special cargo drop for Operational Group Tinopenner, somewhere over occupied France. His arrival was a disappointment. Captain Marcus and his OG Tinopenner team were expecting a replacement radio operator and a fresh supply of C3 explosives. They got Dr. Thorne and a heavy crate filled with 100 small black metal objects. The first combat test was a disaster, but not for the reasons Thorne expected. He and a two-man Maquis team, guided by an OSS operative, moved on the Grenoble line. The night of April 18th was clear, the moon too bright. Thorne selected a curve in the track, knowing the lateral forces would be highest there. He carried the M3 in a canvas bag. As they approached the embankment, a German patrol, laying low in a ditch, opened up. It was a simple, random encounter. No one was hit, but the element of surprise was gone. The team scattered, running for their lives. Thorne, breathless and terrified, his asthma flaring, barely made it back to the safe house, his bag and its precious contents intact. He had failed. The Maquis were furious. "Your magic, Doctor," one of them spat. "It is too slow." Thorne was shaken, but his mind was clear. The problem wasn't the device, it was the doctrine. They were still thinking like demolitionists, spending time sneaking around. The device was fast. They should be fast, too. He needed a different target. Not a patrolled main line, but a vulnerable one. He and Captain Marcus studied the maps. A secondary line, a single-track spur, was being used to move heavy ammunition and V-1 rocket components from a forest depot. It was less heavily guarded. On the night of April 21, 1944, Thorne, Captain Marcus, and Antoine went out alone. This time, there was no team, no heavy gear. Just 3 men in dark clothes. They waited in the damp woods, listening. They heard the train long before they saw it. A heavy Kriegs locomotive, war locomotive, pulling a long string of boxcars, chugging slowly up the grade. Thorne's calculations raced. It was moving at less than 15 miles per hour. Perfect. "Now," Marcus whispered. The train was half a mile away. Thorne didn't sneak. He walked out of the woods, moved to the track, knelt and snapped the M3 device onto the rail. The sound was a dull, heavy thwack. He was back in the tree line in less than 10 seconds. They lay in the dirt, their hearts pounding. The click-clack of the wheels grew louder, a monstrous, rhythmic heartbeat. The locomotive's headlamp swept the trees. The engine hit the device. It happened exactly as it had in the test. A sudden, jarring squeal of tortured metal. It was not the sound of an explosion, but the sound of physics being violated. The 80-ton locomotive seemed to rear up, its front bogie lifting clear of the rail. It hung there for a terrible second, then crashed down onto the ballast, its immense weight driving it deep into the earth. It toppled over, slowly, almost gracefully like a dying animal, landing on its side with a ground-shaking whump that was felt, rather than heard. Then the secondary explosions began. The boxcars, loaded with artillery shells, accordioned into each other. The first car erupted in a bright orange flash, then a second, then a third. A chain reaction of catastrophic detonations lit up the forest, sending shrapnel and debris raining down for half a mile. Thorne, Marcus, and Antoine could only stare, their faces lit by the inferno. Antoine looked at Thorne, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sacre bleu," he whispered. "Sacre bleu." If stories of quiet innovation changing the course of the war fascinate you, stay with us. The next chapter of this battle wasn't fought in the field, but in the corridors of power. The message sent by OG Tinapener's radio operator that night was intentionally spare. It was transmitted in a burst of high-speed code, logged and decrypted at OSS HQ in London's Baker Street. The message read, "Night of 21st April. Target 44B, munitions spur. Confirmed destroyed. 1 locomotive, 12 cars. Line blocked, 0 explosives used, 0 casualties. Thorne device M3. Exceeded expectations. Repeat, 0 explosives." The initial reaction in London was confusion. The Special Operations Duty Officer read the decrypt and immediately flagged it. "0 explosives? Must be a transmission error." He radioed back. Message garbled. "Please confirm explosive charge weights and casualties." Captain Marcus, receiving the query in France, became enraged. He saw Thorne, pale and exhausted but vindicated, sleeping by the radio set. He grabbed the message pad and wrote a blistering reply, one that became legendary in OSS circles. Message not garbled, I repeat, 0 explosives used. Doctor. Thorne's doorstop derailed entire train. Track destroyed by locomotive, not RDX. Line is closed. Request immediate airdrop. 500-5000 M3 devices to all OG and Jedburgh teams in sector. This is a war-winning weapon. This time, the message did not go to the SO branch. It was flagged for priority and went directly to the desk of Colonel David K.E. Bruce, the head of OSS in Europe. Bruce, a pragmatic diplomat and lawyer, understood the implication immediately. He was not a munitions expert, but he was a master of logistics. He saw the numbers. 1 4-pound device, placed by one man in 10 seconds, achieving the same result as a 50-pound demolition charge placed by a team of 6 in 20 minutes. He bypassed the skeptical Army colonels and authorized an emergency production run at OSS and SOE workshops in the UK. The confrontation came a week later, not in a field, but in a hastily Googled meeting at SHAF headquarters. The Transportation Committee, responsible for Plan Vert, was convened. The Army Air Forces were there, presenting reconnaissance photos of their successful bombing of the Amiens rail yard. Then, the OSS representative presented the Tinapener report. An RAF air marshal scoffed. "A derailment? Really? That's what we're discussing? We are cratering entire switching yards, and you're celebrating one toppled train." A U.S. Army general from the Engineer Corps chimed in. "The report says the Germans had the line cleared in 48 hours. Our bombing runs take yards offline for 72 minimum." The OSS man, a quiet major who had read Thorne's original paper, held his ground. "General, you're missing the point. We don't care if they clear the line. The Germans have 40 Haud and Reichsbahn workers in France. They will clear the line. The objective isn't to make a permanent crater. It's to create chaos. It's to make every single kilometer of track a potential failure point." He paused, letting the implications land. "The M3 isn't a demolition. It's a virus. The Air Forces are loud. They tell the Germans exactly where we are hitting. This is silent. It's anonymous. After 2 or 3 of these, every German engineer will drive his train at 10 kilometers an hour, terrified that the next rail will betray him. We aren't just blocking a line, we are stopping the entire network." The room was silent. The debate had shifted. This wasn't about explosives versus steel. It was about brute force versus psychology. SHAF gave its approval. The M3 sabotage device was cleared for mass distribution. The true test was not the single success on a quiet spur. It was scale. As May 1944 bled into June, the skies over France filled with C-47s on moonlit nights. They weren't just dropping spies and guns. They were dropping thousands of canvas-wrapped bundles, each containing 20 M3 flange riders. The Jedburgh and OG teams, working with the Maquis, distributed them with frantic urgency. The instructions were simple, often just a single cartoon diagram. Snap this to the rail. Walk away. The night of June 5, 1944. D-Day. As the Allied fleet steamed toward Normandy, Plan Vert was activated in full. This was not a test. This was the performance. We follow 3 teams simultaneously, part of a massive, coordinated Night of the Derailer. Scene 1. Near Amiens. 01:30. A team of 3 maquisards, led by a 19-year-old student, creep toward the main line from Paris. They are terrified. They have never done this before. Their training was a 10-minute briefing from a Jedburgh radio operator. Each man carries 2 M3s. They don't place them together. They place them 100 meters apart, on opposite rails. They snap them on. Thwack, thwack. They are gone in 90 seconds. At 02:10, a German troop train, racing north to reinforce the coast, hits the first device. The engine derails, ripping up the track. The cars behind it, filled with Panzer Grenadiers, pile into the wreckage. Scene 2. South of St. Lo. 02:00. An OG team, the Patriots, work with a veteran Maquis cell. Their target is a bridge. They don't waste explosives on the steel structure. Instead, they place 6 M3s on the bridge itself. A German armored patrol train with an 80-mm gun mounted on a flat car approaches. It hits the devices. The engine and the gun car derail on the bridge, not destroying the structure, but plugging it. The wreckage is so twisted and inaccessible that it will take German engineers a full week to clear it. The line is cut. Scene 3. The Rhone Valley. 03:00. This is the critical artery for the 11th Panzer Division. Elias Thorn, his mission with Tinapenneur complete, is now acting as a technical advisor to the regional FFI command. He oversees the distribution. He insists, do not hit every train. Hit one train, every 20 kilometers, on every major line. The Maquis obey. That night, they conduct 40 separate derailments along a 300-kilometer stretch. The result is not just 40 blocked lines, it is systemic paralysis. The reports that reached Rommel's headquarters at La Roche-Guyon were apocalyptic. It wasn't that a few lines were cut. It was that the entire network had failed all at once, in 100 different places. There were no bomb craters. There were few reports of explosions. There was just failure. Trains had simply fallen over. German transport manifests from the invasion period, June 6-10, are a testament to the chaos. Train 404, munitions, derailed, cause unknown. Train 211, troop transport, derailed, suspect track failure. Train 558, Panzer refit, derailed, sabotage. The 11th Panzer Division, which SHAF Analytics had predicted would reach the beaches in 72 hours, took 9 days. Every time it tried to load onto trains, the trains were derailed. Every time it tried to move by road, it was strafed by Allied aircraft who knew exactly where it was. The M3 had worked. The doorstop had held the door. The immediate consequence of the Night of the Derailer was a catastrophic breakdown of German command and control. The Wehrmacht was blinded. Field reports from German engineers collected after the liberation of Paris, reveal a state of panic and confusion. They initially blamed track fatigue or partisan tampering with fish plates. They simply could not conceive of a device so simple, so effective, and so widespread. By the time they captured their first M3 device in late June and understood its function, the war in Normandy was already lost. The beachhead was secure. The M3 device became a standard, if unglamorous, part of the OSS and SOE toolkit. It was mass-produced in simple foundries in England, often by civilian factories, and dropped by the tens of thousands. Its use was documented in Italy, in the Balkans, and even in the China-Burma-India theater, for use against Japanese rail lines. It was perhaps the most cost-effective weapon of the entire war. For a manufacturing cost of less than $1 per unit, a single 4-pound piece of steel could reliably neutralize 2.010 tons of enemy logistics. Elias Thorne's legacy was, like the device itself, silent and profound. He was exfiltrated from France in August 1944, just before the liberation of Paris. He returned not to Washington, but to Altoona, Pennsylvania. He was debriefed, signed a stack of non-disclosure agreements, and was instructed by the War Department to forget everything he had done. He was, after all, still a 4F civilian. He went back to his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad, analyzing track mechanics and stress failures. His invention, the M3 Sabotaged device, was classified for 30 years. Its success was never publicized, folded into the larger, more romantic narrative of the French resistance and the Jedburgh teams. Thorne received no medal. There was no parade for the man who had perfected the art of the derailment. He lived a quiet life, raised a family, and died in 1978. His obituary in the Altoona Mirror celebrated him as a loyal employee of the railroad for 40 years. His children knew he had done something in the war. But he never spoke of it. He was, to the end, a railroad man. The true legacy of the M3 was not the steel, but the idea. It was a philosophical shift. It was the victory of insight over brute force. It proved, definitively, that the most effective weapon is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. The most effective weapon is the one that understands the enemy's system, his strengths, his dependencies, his arrogance, better than he understands it himself. Thorne didn't defeat the Reichsbahn by overpowering it. He defeated it by using its own immense weight and momentum against it. This principle is the very heart of all modern asymmetrical warfare. The M3 was not just a tool. It was a conceptual ancestor. It is the same philosophy that guides a modern cyber attack, which doesn't seek to destroy a power grid with a bomb, but to unbalance it with a line of code. It's the same logic used in economic warfare, which seeks to derail a nation's economy not with an army, but with a targeted sanction. It is the doctrine of the fulcrum and the lever, the search for the small critical point of failure that can cascade into systemic collapse. We now live in a world of high-speed rail, of bullet trains and maglevs, moving at hundreds of miles per hour. These marvels of engineering race through the same French countryside, often on the very same rights of way, where Elias Thorne and the Maquis once waited in the dark. The rails are now welded, the ballast automated, the systems computerized. But the physics remain. A wheel is still held to a track by a small flange of steel. The story of the M3 is a reminder that true innovation often comes from the margins. It comes from the quiet observers, the ones the experts dismiss as impractical or foolish. It's a testament to the fact that the most rigid, powerful systems often contain the seeds of their own spectacular failure, waiting only for a 4-pound doorstop, applied in the right place, at the right time. Every great idea begins as an act of defiance against impossibility. What impossible ideas do you think could change the world?